Bunny McDiarmid is a Greenpeace activist with heart and soul.
We are all just like you guys. We're all just people who care about this place.
1984
In 1984, she joined the Rainbow Warrior as a deckhand, and in the next year she protested against French nuclear tests. But 2 bombs of the French Secret Service sank the ship. 1 crew member died. Today, she's the managing director of Greenpeace International, fighting against nuclear power, the pollution of forests and oceans, and for a better future. Neon Green Network welcomes Bunny McDiarmid.
Thank you. Whew. What a huge audience. Thank you for inviting me. It's quite heartening but also inspiring to see so many people sitting in a conference or a meeting about the planet, and also to see so many young people. These lights are incredibly bright. I feel like I want sunglasses. I'm told I have to stay within the boundaries of this green dot. Wouldn't it be great if everyone did that? We've got some pictures, but that myth about women being able to multitask doesn't apply to me, so I've handed it to someone in the audience, so they're going to click through some of the photos. I just want to acknowledge Andrea for all the great work that you're doing on elephants. Thank God you went through those life-changing moments. Thank God for all of us. And instead of telling you about where I am today, I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I got here. And I hope you can understand my accent. You have to tell me if I talk too fast or wave at me if I'm saying things in an odd way in English, because I do realize even though I come from an English-speaking country, we have a strange accent in my place. And if you haven't worked it out by now, I come from New Zealand, otherwise known as Aotearoa by Māori, which is the indigenous people of New Zealand. And New Zealand is actually a country that's been very defined by activism. It was the very first country in the world to give women the vote. And we didn't get it because we asked nicely, we got it because we fought for it. For quite a long time. I come from a big family. I had a really pretty conventional formal education. I went to university, and I thought, I'll go to university and I'll learn about the world. And actually, the only thing I really learned there was how to read, which was quite a good thing to learn, but I figured out I needed to get out into the world to actually understand how the world ticked. And by the time I was 21, I was on a boat, a 100-year-old ship, wooden, nothing modern on it whatsoever. We had to cut wood, put it in a wood-burning stove, bake bread on a daily basis. It was an extraordinary experience. I'd never sailed before. And one of the jobs that I got on the boat was replace the rotten pieces of timber below the waterline. I was also not a carpenter. But I did have a supervisor, thank goodness, otherwise we may not have made it across the Atlantic. But one of the things that taught me doing that job was that I could be and do something different from the piece of paper that I got from coming out of university. And that was quite an important lesson for me to learn as a young woman at 21 years old, that I could actually be more than what a formal education had taught me I could be. And from that boat, I shifted to another boat. I shifted to the Rainbow Warrior. I met the Rainbow Warrior in 1985, and actually I met the Rainbow Warrior, not Greenpeace. I'd actually never heard of Greenpeace when I joined the Rainbow Warrior, but I loved what this boat was going to do. And this boat was going to, on an anti-nuclear campaign in the Pacific. And at that stage in the world, nuclear was the big scary monster in the room. It was what frightened me as a young woman. It was the fear that was amongst many of us as young people. And I imagine it's not dissimilar from what a lot of young people feel today about climate change. And when I met the warrior, I thought, okay, I'm going to join this because I want to be part of the anti-nuclear movement. I want to do something about it. And this was a group of people that were actually going to go out there and do something. And the first thing that the warrior did, after we turned it from a motorboat into a sailing boat, and oh my goodness, did she turn into a fine sailing boat. We went to a place in the North Pacific called the Marshall Islands. And we were going there so we could help the Rongelap community relocate. And the reason why these people needed to move away from their island was because they had been irradiated by nuclear fallout from the US atmospheric testing program that had taken place there decades earlier. So this had happened to them 20, 30 years before the warrior arrived. But they had experienced an enormous amount of illness. They had jellyfish babies, they had kids that were ill. 90% of the children that were under the age of 10 at the time of the radioactive fallout had had thyroid cancer and their thyroids removed. One young man died of leukemia, but neither their own government or the US government was willing to recognize what had happened. But they just sent doctors from the military establishments in the US on a regular basis to study these people, because they had this perfect controlled population that they could study about what the impacts of nuclear contamination was. So they had invited Greenpeace to help them move to another island. So when we arrived there, all these older women came out in a small boat holding up a sign that said, "We love the future of our kids." But they weren't ready to move. Nobody had packed anything. So we spent the next few days sitting around with this community talking, along with their senator. And after those few days, they said, okay, now we're ready to pack, and now we're ready to move. So they took apart their entire houses, packed up all their belongings, got onto a boat with a group of people they'd never seen before in their lives, and sailed to an island 100 miles away that many of them had never seen before either. And that was a huge decision for them to take. In the Marshall Islands, land is like part of your identity. It's your middle name. Everybody is born with land rights. Everybody is born with fishing rights. It's something you inherit. It's something you pass along to your kids. They say in the Marshalls that if you lose your land, your spirit goes too. So this was a major decision for this community to make, but they did it because they really believed it was the best thing to do for their kids and for their kids' kids. So that was an extraordinary thing for all of us to go through. Nobody was dramatic about it. Everyone just got on with the job. We shifted these people to this new island where there was no building set up, basically put all their plywood from their old houses into the water and it all floated ashore, and they started rebuilding their community. This is a story that not a lot of people knew about, not a lot of people in the US knew about, probably not a lot of people in the world know about. But it's a real story about nuclear legacy. Someone mentioned Chernobyl earlier here, and this was their Chernobyl. And it was also, but it wasn't just a story about nuclear legacy, which is intergenerational, as we've all found out and continue to find out. It was also a story of perseverance, resilience, speaking truth to a very big power, and also believing and imagining that you can create a different future, and then doing something about it. That really changed me, being part of that, because I learned that the kind of violence that we're doing to ourselves and to people and the violence that we're doing to the earth are very much connected. In New Zealand, they have a saying that says, "I am the river and the river is me." And that's probably the shortest and the biggest version I've heard of explaining how intimately our fates and the fates of the planet, or the fates of our living natural world, are connected. What we do to the world, we do to ourselves. And the Marshallese taught me that, and the people that I grew up around in New Zealand taught me that as well. The Marshall Islands and what happened in Rongelap is a bit like a metaphor of the bigger story in the world. It's kind of universal, and it sort of describes a little bit what bonded me to Greenpeace, and also what made me stay in Greenpeace for all these 30 plus years. After Rongelap, got to step back from the lights again. After Rongelap, I stayed in Greenpeace, but I realised that I will probably always be a bit of an activist. And activism for me is quite a new, being called an activist is actually quite a new word to me, because I often thought I was just actually just a reasonably ordinary person doing ordinary things. And all of our histories, I think, have many, many examples of ordinary people who have done quite extraordinary things. People who have decided at one moment or another to stand up and say, no, I disagree, or yes, I'm going to be part of that. And that's what's often changed the world, these sometimes tiny, small activities by small groups or big groups of people that have actually shifted the axis of the world in a really major way. A few months ago, actually it wasn't even that long ago, even though it feels like that long ago, I participated in an action in Belgium. I climbed a 90-metre chimney with a bunch of other activists in the port of Antwerp. And this was the oil refinery of Total, which is one of the oil companies that actually wants to drill at the mouth of the Amazon River. And at the mouth of the Amazon River is where they've also just recently discovered a coral reef, a very old and a very large coral reef. So this company wants to go there. This is one of these frontiers. Wants to go to the mouth of the Amazon River and drill for oil, potentially destroying this newly discovered coral reef, destroying the livelihoods of the communities that live in that area, but also looking for fuel that we simply cannot afford to burn anymore. So I wanted to add my voice to many, many others to make sure that Total heard that this is the wrong thing to be doing. That was a reasonably big deal for me to do, because I'm also not a climber. It was also a big deal for all the other climbers in that group to take me along with them. I was kind of a liability. Nobody wants to drop their international executive director from a 90-metre chimney. Kind of changes the message you were hoping to put out there. But it was an incredibly satisfying thing to do. Moving into this job as an international executive director, it's not every day of the week you get to go and do something like that. So it was really wonderful to be able to do that. And it actually made my daughter really proud as well, which is quite a hard thing to do these days. But in addition to that, what made it really satisfying was doing something with a group of people that had a common purpose and had enough courage to actually act together to do it. And that sounds big, but actually it's not. Doing something meaningful, millions of surveys will tell you, make people far more happy than buying more stuff. And doing something with a group of people that feels meaningful is even better. It's so much more empowering, I think, and hopeful to actually act when you see a problem or when you feel overwhelmed by what's happening in the world, than to just sit and panic. I've been on a lot of boats now, so I know what it feels like to panic a bit. And it feels way better to just get involved with trying to change the situation than panicking. The total situation and our kind of campaign against New Frontier oil is absolutely about climate change. And climate change for all of us is one of those issues that can either paralyze us or motivate us. And we simply have to be motivated. Our little planet is totally under attack. And guess who's the attacker? Us. We know that we are the cause of climate change. 97% of the scientists agree. The good thing is we actually also know what the solutions are. The only thing we have to do now is make sure the political will is there to drive those solutions home. The Paris Agreement was really important, but it's not going to be effective unless we make sure what all those governments agreed to and ratified in lickety-split history-making time are not delivered. And that's where we all come in. We can't rely on the governments to do it. We've been talking about this for 25 years, and your president talked about how 30 years ago economists were talking about this. I remember going to Kiribati, which is another small island state in the North Pacific, and talking about climate change when the initial scientific reports were coming out in the late 1980s. And the president of Kiribati said to me, "Do you know what they're telling us? They're saying in 50 years' time, maybe our islands won't be habitable. 50 years after that, maybe our language disappears. And 50 years after that, our culture will no longer exist on this planet." And I thought, my God, this man got it like that. If only we could transfer his brain into all the brains of the politicians that sit in the places that are not moving on climate change. We have time. We actually have time to get to where we need to be with climate change. There's a lot already on the move, and there's a lot of hope out there amongst the business community and amongst many politicians as well. We can look at what happened in the US and go, shit. That's not going to be helpful. But you know what? What is extraordinarily helpful in the US is that the majority of Americans actually want to see action on climate change, many of them Republicans. A huge number of cities, mayors, local governments, businesses in the US want to see that change happen. So I think the Trump administration has a huge fight on its hand in its own country. But we will not get what we need without political will. And the political will not be there without people holding their government's feet to the fire. And you know what? We need the EU. I am not a European, but we need a progressive Europe. Because a progressive Europe actually stands for many of the ideals, many of the values that I myself and Greenpeace are fighting for. There is an awful lot of messages out there today about hate, division, them and us, intolerance. I'm actually really proud to be part of a conference or a meeting that was opened by your president, who believed that a progressive agenda was enough to be able to stop the populism and the authoritarianism, see, I can't even say it, agenda and that trend that's driving a lot across Europe at the moment. We need to take that trend seriously, and we need to take people's fears seriously as well. It's not that the EU is perfect. There are a lot of things that don't work. There's a lot of times when you think that Brussels is just there for the elite, for big business, for corporates. It's our job to make sure that they're there for the interests of the many, of the people and the planet. The EU is probably one of the strongest symbols that we have of nation states overcoming divisions and borders. And that's really important today. Differences are hard, I totally get that. But if you look at nature, it teaches us that diversity is absolutely essential to our survival. We can't live with monocultures. We need the differences. That is what's going to make us strong. So I really appeal to you, as a non-European, to make this a progressive Europe, to fight for a Europe that's really strong on environment, really strong on human rights, and really strong on political freedoms. We cannot take for granted what we've won. We cannot be complacent about that, because things can change just like that. We've seen it with Brexit. We've seen it in the US. So we have to fight for what we've won and not think it's just going to be there forever. We have to work in our communities and act when we feel like something's not right. Nobody needs to climb, or not everybody needs to climb a 90-meter chimney. There are many different ways that you can make a difference, small ways and big ways. We need the many sacrifices of the many to change things, not the big sacrifices of the few. This is I think maybe this little planet we live on may be the only planet in the universe with life on it as we know it. It's precious. Humans are a force of nature. But we're a conscious force, and we can be a force for good if we decide it. All we need is enough of us who have the courage to actually actively work together to make that change for the better. And I've seen it time and time again. We can do it. So let's do it. Oh, sorry.
Bunny McDiarmid, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. Bunny, you have so much experience as an activist. We've seen your pictures now as a deckhand on the Rainbow Warrior. How do you feel about activism today? Has it changed a lot in the last 30 years?
I think there's more people active today than there were 30 years ago. I think it's more possible for people to find ways to connect. That's a good side of the internet, social media. It's a great organizing tool. People find people that think the same as them and want to change things the same way they do and find ways that they can do it together. Mm-hmm. I think there's many more ways that people are active today than I think they were even 30 years ago.
And is it a lot easier now to get an ear of governments today? Do you think you're being taken more seriously by more and more parts of the world?
It fluctuates. Well, Greenpeace certainly is a much bigger organization than it was 30 years ago. But Greenpeace will always have an inside-outside strategy. We want to be able to talk to people, convince people that this is where we should go to make the positive change we need, but we also want to be ready to act. Mm-hmm. Because we can't rely on them to move in that direction, just with talk.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for your work. Thank you, Bunny. And yes.